Alright guys, and now I want to talk about another attacking idea, which is based on the pawn chain where the king castle, so the king's roof. And for example, there was a world champion by the name of Tal, and Tal would just sacrifice on all these four squares. Sometimes the pawn would come to g6 and he would sacrifice on g6, so it just depends on where these four squares went. So it all depends on the roof pawns. But if you can destroy two of those four roof pawns, usually you can get to the king. And this game that I'm going to show you guys today, which is between Tal and his opponent, Grandmaster Gurganidze from Georgia, shows the idea of destroying the roof pawns in order to get more pieces near the king. So he's all wide open and ready to be checkmated. Okay, so we set him up and decoy him to the right place. In order to open him up, in order to destroy those four squares, first we have to place our pieces close, usually in the diameter of these four squares. So I make this the king side square, and we try to get our pieces at least looking at that diameter. We can't have a knight on c5 and an attack on the king side. It just doesn't work that way. Because if we are to get those four squares, we need to have pieces on f4, g5, h5, all those squares, and from there we can strike. So Tal just goes on with development, just plays a normal opening, takes the bishop pair for free. Black was very generous with the bishop pair in this game, and black just castles and says, I have no weaknesses, everything is fine, I've taken out all my minor pieces, what's the problem? But so far the roof is safe. Yet white has two bishops, and it's just a matter of how he can use them to create weaknesses in this pawn chain and then blow it up. These four squares. The funny thing about these four squares, if the opponent puts the pawns on this complex, I call this the light square roof complex, and the other one is called the dark square roof complex. If the opponent puts the pawns on the light squares, you can infiltrate, get in through the dark squares. And vice versa, if he puts them all on e7, f6, g7, h6, then you can get in through the light squares because they have just been weakened. So we put like a queen on g6 and a bishop on d3. You have a checkmate coming up already, all because he put the pawns on that dark square color complex, leaving holes behind. Okay. The funny thing is, Tal himself, who was playing this game as white, he was once asked, why do you draw so many games nowadays? And he said that people think I try to draw, or I became less aggressive than I used to be. But that's actually not true. It's just my opponents don't let me sacrifice on e6, f7, g7, h7, you know? And because of that, he couldn't win any games anymore, because his opponents would defend those four squares so many times, he just couldn't get through their defense and couldn't checkmate them as easily as he did in his youth. So in this game, just rook e1, rook e8, we are getting our pieces closer to this square, to the king side square, and very soon we're gonna strike. So now we got the pawn instead of the knight in the middle, kicking away the chimney knight, so the h7 pawn becomes weaker when he leaves. And now we bring in the queen, so the queen can see into the square of the king side. And after a5, black is just playing useless moves. They're not really attacking anything, no reason behind them. Now white offers up a gift. He says, either I will go with h5, h6 and blow up your king side, or you can take the pawn and try and see what happens there. And black says, oh, I can't resist your gift, let me just take that pawn. But after g3, bishop e7, suddenly we have the open highway. So we're setting up the attack on that h7 pawn, and we're setting up on the whole light square complex. Let's see how that worked out. After g6, all these dark squares have been weakened, but they can be protected by the bishop so far. But in the future, there will be problems. Also, what has that just created? What are the consequences of g6? First of all, the f7 pawn is backwards, and the h7 pawn is also backwards. There is more to hook onto for white, to latch onto, because black just created a new target. We're not gonna sacrifice a queen right away, but we're definitely thinking about moves like bishop takes g6 in the future. Instead, Tal first brings in the rook to look at h7 to prepare the final blows that are coming up. Black says, let me put the bishop so I can protect all my dark squares near the king. First, we bring in the last piece that was sleeping because we want everyone to join in the fun. We don't want anybody missing out. That's not nice to them. And after queen to c7, rook takes h7. That's what I mean by destroying those light square complexes and dark square complexes. You see, because the king is so far away from the rest of his army and they've deserted him. They're deserters. Now the white queen can come in, the other rook can come in, and we'll just do a nice little checkmate on h8 or h7, using the help of our bishops, of course. Black can't really help because his pieces are so far away. He doesn't have to take, and in the game he didn't. In the game he took the e5 pawn and said, so what? If you play rook to h1, rook h1, I got the square covered. I'll gladly take your 2 rooks for the queen and probably win. But instead, Tal says, let me destroy the whole light square complex. He destroys all those backward pawns because they were so weak and only protected by the king. The king should not be protecting pawns, the pawns should be protecting the king. And that's what Gurgunidze did wrong here. And so after he takes the rook on f7, bishop takes g6, says, come out, king. If you guys remember the lesson on king hands, that's exactly what we're doing right now. The king says, I don't want to come out because if I do, first of all, you have bishop f4 check winning the queen, and probably there is more unpleasantries. So no, I'll just run back home and let you show your brilliance, Mr. Tal. And Mr. Tal did just that. First, he just took the rook, but he's actually setting up the discovered attack. Now that the whole complex, the roof complex, has disappeared, we are at liberty to attack however we want. Black tries to replace the roof complex, and sometimes a bishop can act as a good replacement, as a substitute for those missing pawns. Especially to fill in holes. But right now there are too many holes, and they're not just on the dark squares, they're also on the light squares, which the white bishop controls. So let's see how this ends up. Bishop d7, let's pick on the weakness that nobody can defend. We've destroyed the whole complex and now we're coming for the last link. And black is trying to keep it together, no problem. We'll just come for c6, then bring our last rook in because we don't want anybody missing the party, then defend against all threats and slowly but surely win the game. And it finished with bishop f6. We are attacking checkmate. Now that the king is so open, they just can't withstand this assault. The queen has to come back and beg for mercy, but white says no thank you. I will decoy the queen, I will get rid of her, and when she goes away I'll checkmate you eventually. Let's see how that turned out. Bishop g5. It turns out the queen has almost no good moves, and Mr. Gurgunidze actually resigned after rook d7 because the queen is a horrible piece, the king is completely open, no roof anywhere in sight, the rook is the only good piece, the bishop is very vulnerable, he can get hit at any moment, the knight, I'm not even gonna say anything. Alright, so black is in dire straits. He couldn't find a solution to threats such as, well, first of all, rook takes e7, but also if the knight goes away, queen takes e6. Okay, guys, so remember those 4 important pawns. I will point them out again. They apply to both sides. e6, f7, g7, h7. Sometimes it's g6 or h6. You just have to adjust. And for white, e3, f2, g2, h2. Try to destroy at least 2 of those pawns the same way that Tal destroyed them in this game, even if it costs you a piece. Because if you can sacrifice a piece for those complexes, then you're doing a great job and you'll probably get to the king.